comparing the UFC with Tesla. The two ultimate businesses of our generation, of this time, are the UFC and Tesla. I want to discuss this in several ways. First, of course, here at Orange Capital Partners, we are interested in Tesla because it's our largest position. So we're always going to find new angles and try to look at different places to understand the business of Tesla better. And what better way to find out about yourself than to look at places you wouldn't expect and then see a mirror image. And this is what happened with the UFC. I'm very intrigued by the business. This, I like combat sports. I've been training combat sports for all my life, but I'm more intrigued by the business of the UFC actually than the actual sport. And the reason I was thinking about this, why am I so intrigued? And I think it's the parallels between the UFC and Tesla that are so interesting. So I want to talk about this in this episode. And for new listeners, just to be clear, we do this often here at the Not Even Wrong podcast. The purpose of this podcast is to give people a sense of what it feels like to run a hedge fund. So looking at a business like the UFC and looking at parallels and mirror images or things to learn from the business, that is absolutely paramount and very important for a hedge fund manager, particularly if you have a large position like we have. This is Not Even Wrong podcast. It's March 16th, 2023. This is Krim Delco. For today, the fund is up 2%. The market is up 1%. For the year, we are up 49.1%. The market is up 2.3%. We're outperforming by 47.8%. The market's still open. These things could change. So let's jump right into... before I go there, just a little bit of an update. The financials are, of course, the big news item. On the macro side, we had problems here in Silicon Valley with Silicon Valley Bank. Now we have problems with Credit Suisse in Switzerland. It's driving down the banking stocks all over the world. I think there's a podcast I haven't listened to, but the title actually says it all. The podcast with Luigi Zingales and Bethany McLean. They have a title which is the Silicon Valley Bank is the end of banking as we know it. I think this is what's going to happen here. We need to nationalize banks either factually or at least virtually, in a sense that they have to be incredibly regulated and treated like utilities. Banks are utility. They're like the electricity company. You need payment systems, you need savings products, you need mortgages, but that's about it. And it shouldn't be a risk business at all. Banks are not in the business of risk. There is a certain slew of people who are in the business of risk, such as hedge funds and VCs and private equity and those types. And the banks shouldn't be in that business. The banks should be like insurance companies. They should be highly regulated and very restrictive in the way they apply risk. This is my opinion, and I think this is what's going to happen here. This is the way we see this pan out. I mean, this is the only realistic way to do this. Anything else, let's say letting depositors lose money in banks or investors lose money in brokers, meaning not the investors in the stock of the companies, but the actual depositors, would be a death sentence for the system as we know it, because nobody would trust anybody anymore. You can't trust your counterparty then when you do a payment and things like that. So you can't do business. So it's not possible. That's why we have central banks. The reason we have central banks is to provide protection for these types of events. So we're pretty certain that the central banks around the world will do what they need to do. We're not talking about bailouts here for investors or bondholders or anything like that. We're talking simply making sure that depositors are safe. This is all we're asking for, and it has to happen so the system can continue. I think with a utility-like banking system, we're actually better off in the long term. And this is for another podcast. But just to sort of summarize the situation, the financials. As far as the market is concerned, there's there's potentially a silver lining there, which is that we could have lower interest rates now and a less aggressive Fed, because some of the excesses now have been really wiped out by the banking system being near collapse. So we'll have less lending, less stupid mortgage lending and high real estate prices, and all of that stuff should come down. It's already come down, but now it's being marked to market, which is very important, I think, also in the fight against inflation. The big fight, though, is still the government. The government spending way too much money in the US and around the world, particularly in the US. So we need to stop that. And this is, of course, the big fight we need to fight. And that fight has maybe started at best, but it's still way, we have a long ways to go to convince Congress and the White House to spend less money and also reduce the this cognitive liberty fight that we're having to endure with ESG and woke and all that, where we're trying to mingle business and investment with political goals. That is very dangerous, a very dangerous path that needs to be fought. It needs to be fought with all the weapons we have, because this is the ultimate Trojan horse of socialism that is trying to penetrate the US system, and we can't let that happen. The US has been too successful and too important for the world to be crumbled by the same old, I call it European disease, of having this idealistic ideas creeping in and destroying the actual progress in the world, which is voluntary exchange of individuals and being compensated for what they do as participants in the business world, and being compensated for their products and services, generating a profit, reinvesting the profit. This formula has worked the best. If we start mixing that up now with some idealistic ideas of whatever you want to call ESG or DEI, that's not going to get us anywhere. That's just going to get us to a maybe milder version of Cuba or the Soviet Union, which is not what we want. Now let's get to the episode here. So the comparison between the UFC and Tesla, why is this such an interesting situation? Well, first, they're both, I would say, if I had to summarize the two most interesting businesses in the last 10 years, it's the UFC and it's Tesla. And they both have a lot of similarities, some dissimilarities, but let's talk about the similarities. Let's start with, they are disrupting markets, markets that you might have thought 10 years ago are not disruptable. And they both came from a place where most people were making fun of it. So the UFC was, was compared to a cockfight, too violent. Nobody's going to want to watch this. This is ridiculous. It just shows how degenerate humanity has become, stuff like that. The EV side of Tesla was a little bit different. People just said, look, this is not going to work. Nobody wants electric cars. The incumbents will kill this business. They can't do it. It's not doable. So both of them have proven their naysayers wrong. The UFC is the most successful sport, I would say, right now in the world. Maybe the only two sports that are still competing are NFL and soccer. But even soccer, it's really only a few events, such as the World Cup and maybe the Champions League. But overall, the UFC just, on a weekly basis is churning out massive fights with huge audiences, lots of social media presence. And they're doing a great job. And I think that the similarities between Tesla and the UFC, one of the biggest one is that both are vertically integrated. It's very important. So they're integrating the supply chain. Let's say the UFC has performance institutes all over the world where they're grooming fighters, they're grooming coaches, they're creating also a whole media, let's say, media supply chain with videos and how to do, let's say, they're humanizing the fighters, which is very, very important in a sense that there is this culture within the UFC of humanizing, of showing who they actually are as humans, what they eat, who are their families, where do they live. And I think this is adding to the panache of the sport, because you're watching two individuals fight in the ring or in the octagon, but it's more than that. It's really two people with attachments, with families, with the way they eat, the way they train, who they are as people. And I think that is a big, big plus that has not been done in any sport before. There is, of course, like in the fight business, you always have controversy. So this is one of the things the UFC is doing really well, which is creating controversy. Conor McGregor being the superstar here, always creating controversy. But it's not just about that. There's lots of fights. Islam Makhachev, Gilbert Burns, top of my head, people who are, Justin Gaethje, who's just, he's going to have a fight in a couple of days in London. Those are not controversial people. They're not hateful. They don't create anger or against their opponents. And they're still, they still collect millions of views. Volkanovski, the former pound for pound #1, he's not a nasty person. at all. He's a very, balanced, intellectual human being, actually, with very interesting insights into the fighting business. So there is this whole slew of commentators, of videographers that create content around the UFC, and this is all, some of it has grown organically, but the UFC has done a very good job in sort of keeping everything very close to their chest and developing this infrastructure. So it's a whole, and this is the parallel to Tesla. I've said this many times before and after the Investor Day. The vertical integration of Tesla is the absolute key of the success of Tesla. That's why others can't compete. So this is one of the parallels. The other big parallel, of course, is the center around the founder. At the UFC, it's Dana White. With Tesla, it's Elon Musk. Very similar dynamics. There's this powerful person that is almost bigger than the sport, or in the case of Tesla, the company. And people want to watch him. People want to hear him. He has interesting things to say. Some hate him, some love him. Doesn't matter. The point is he's interesting. And that is, I'm pretty sure that's not by design. These things just happen, and maybe they grow sort of into those roles. In fact, Musk was on the board of Endeavor, which owns the UFC. So maybe there was even some cross-pollination there at the top. I don't know. He's intermediate, and he's resigned now from the board. He's not there anymore. But there has been a connection. But the reason I'm mentioning this is that maybe there has been some discussions. Okay, how can we create interesting content as founders and CEOs of the companies? But I think this has grown organically, which is just an interesting fact, and it adds to the panache again for both companies. If you take any other company in the world, I don't know who you want to, Apple or Google, they just don't have that kind of, you don't want to listen to their leaders, actually. It's uninteresting. And with Musk and the UFC, it's not the case. There's a couple of things also that maybe are a little bit on the negative side, which are similar. One is, of course, the monopolization of the business. So with the vertical integration of the supply chain and the success, what you're going to get also is kind of a monopoly. For example, the UFC is basically, everybody wants to sign with the UFC. If you want to be a successful MMA fighter, you have to be in the UFC. There's no other place to go. On the one hand, that's great because you know where to go. On the other hand, they have power over you. The same actually happens to Tesla, right? Tesla is the place to go. If you're a mechanical, electrical, or software engineer, maybe not software per se, but definitely any kind of engineering. Let's throw in their software too, because it is really all about software also. You want to be at Tesla, or maybe at SpaceX, which is another Elon Musk company. So there's a bit of a monopoly there in terms of hiring. And don't underestimate this. No matter how well-intentioned companies are, when they have power, it can become hairy. And that's definitely one of the risks that I would point out here, that both companies have to be very wary of that, and hopefully they can manage it well. I mean, I don't have a problem with companies like the UFC in terms of, I like to be able to watch the best fighters in the world. I don't want to have to go to other promotions and make sure I don't miss such and such. Let's say there's one fighter at Bellator, cousin of Khabib Nurmagomedov, Usman Nurmagomedov, who is, in my point of view, a phenomenal fighter. Actually, I even saw him live training at the AKA here in San Jose. I was very impressed with him, and it'd be nice to see him fight the best fighters in the world. Well, there's sometimes going to be stuff like that. Francis Ngannou, another free agent who is actually not signed with anybody right now. Certainly would be great to see him fight the best fighters, John Jones in his case, the heavyweight champion at the UFC. But you can't have it all. But the point here is that it's good to have a one place to go and watch the best people. I think I'm a proponent of the Super League in soccer in Europe, where I don't just wait for the Champions League to see the best teams play each other, but I want to see them play each other all the time. I like the NFL for that reason. So I like the MLS, the way they're structuring, particularly the youth side of things, where I'm involved through my son. Over there, the best players are all going to the MLS academies. There is really not a lot of leeway there. If you're not in the MLS academy, you're basically not going to make it. So it's good. It's very tough, and it gives the teams, let's say in the case of the MLS, I can see it. They have a lot of power over the players, and it's very intimidating to be part of that system, because if you're not being asked to join, let's say, an MLS academy, you really are out of even though, let's say, my son right now is not in MLS academy, he's in a let's call it secondary academy. They still compete with the MLS teams, and to some extent they're as good, if not better. But over time, the selection of players will be such that the best players of my son's team will all end up in MLS academy. So by the age of 17, 18, they won't be competitive anymore. And that's, of course, difficult for the players because they have to make it, and it's tough, and the teams have a lot of power. But then it's also good for everybody else because you know where the best players are. Excuse me. So let's say if you have scouts that want to scout, the national team scouts, anybody who's interested in the sport outside of the players themselves have a huge interest and incentive to sort of centralize the sport around one league and one set of, let's say in the case of soccer, one set of teams. And in the case of the UFC, it's just one set of divisions. So there's the lightweight division in the UFC. That's it. If you're in that category, you play in that category, and so on and so forth. So again, there's also, let's say in the case of Tesla, there's a lot of advantages of knowing that the best people are coming to Tesla. So that way you as a person, you want to go work there because you're going to be around the best people. So it's good to know that. You don't have to try your luck with Ford and then Boeing and then blah, blah, blah. Like, the best people are going to be there. So you're going to also grow the fastest and the best. So there's advantages. The disadvantage, again, is the monopoly. And this is one of the things where I think the UFC is going a little bit too far. They're going a little bit too far in monopolizing their power over the fighters. I think they should let fighters make a little bit more money. It's a little bit of I have a sense, I don't know, I'm not an insider, all I get is the outside comments, but it seems to me that it's a bit too much winner takes it all. And the reason you don't want that is, from a UFC perspective, of course, is you want to have a healthy roster of fighters. Now, having said that, I think every fighter in the UFC, at every level, so from a John Jones or either Israel Adesanya or whatever, Pereira, down to the average sort of newcomer who's not even ranked, everybody is better off relative to their rank than 10 years ago. So everybody's better off. In other words, yes, there's maybe a lot more inequality now. There's people flying with private jets to fights while others can barely train, pay for their camp. But everybody as a whole is better off. So the same, I think, applies to let's say, the Tesla situation, where everybody who works for Tesla as a whole, every mechanical engineer is better off than 10, 20 years before Tesla was there, because the profession itself was not very well regarded. But within the sort of, there could be some relative, in other words, there could be inequality. And I think this is an interesting sort of derivative lesson that I've learned by thinking through this problem, which is the two ultimate companies of our generation are Tesla and the UFC. And they both have a lot of positive things. They both teach us a lot about our times and the way we think and the way we tick and what makes things work and what makes things be successful. But they also show us the negative side. And one of them is, of course, the increase in inequality. When you have companies like Tesla, you will increase inequality within Tesla. There will be some stars and there will be some less popular people. And you will also increase the relative difference between you and the competition. So inequality will increase. There's no question about this. The inequality in the UFC is increasing. Again, everybody is better off. Even MMA fighters that aren't on the roster of the UFC are better off because the whole thing is just a lot bigger. There's a lot more money in the game. Same, again, if you look at the Tesla situation, anybody who's in the electrification industry, if you do heat pumps at some, private company in Germany, if you're in the electric car business in China, even if you don't work for Tesla, you're better off because there's a lot more money, a lot more value in the whole thing created by Tesla. The same applies to MMA fighters. So there's parallels here again, but I think I would say the biggest negative that I see with the UFC, actually, and again, this is a negative that is also risky with Tesla, and that is that there's a feeling sort of that Dana White at the UFC is kind of losing a little bit of his interest, and that could hurt the UFC's bringing in that power slap, for example, which is silly, and combining it with the UFC, and people at UFC, fans, they kind of don't like that. I don't know what the story there is, but my point here is that, of course, this one-man key risk is always a big risk. It's a good thing to have a leader like that, but then to rely too much on him could be a risk. The same applies to Tesla. I think Tesla is doing a good job in building a bench. We had the investor day where Dubalino was very vocal and very interesting. There's others interesting people there that certainly could step in or at least be part of the solution to replace somebody like Elon Musk once he chooses to retire or be less instrumental. The UFC has that too. There's people behind the scenes there that are important, but I would say it's definitely something to work on. Like, let's say if I was a shareholder of UFC, I would ask Dana White to be a bit more maybe active in building a bench. Maybe it's, I would think that, you know, these people aren't stupid. They know what they're doing. They haven't been this successful for nothing. So meaning they are good what they're doing also in creating a proper replacement, I'm pretty sure. Or not a replacement, but a bench that is there to help or step in should there be a need. So to summarize, the parallels between the UFC and Tesla are very interesting. They're interesting because those are the two defining companies of our times. They're the companies which define what it means to build an industry, be successful, create lots of value, develop talent. They show us that how important vertical integration is. They show us how important leadership is, how important culture is. One thing I haven't mentioned, I just want to mention here, both of these companies have been very, very vocal about fighting the atrocities committed to us during the COVID times when, you know, lockdowns and all that happened. They were fighting against that. They kept their businesses open. They kept the show going on, which is the only way we can fight anything in the world, which is by keep the show going on and help people and make sure that people's lives get better by being productive instead of, you know, locking them up in homes and things like that. So they're the antithesis of autocrats like let's say Anthony Fauci. The antithesis, even though they themselves, even though Musk and Dana White themselves could be perceived as autocrats, but they're the types of autocrats that capitalism produces all the time, which is the ones that by being autocratic create a lot of value for everybody else. And this is how the system works. This is so. They're the companies of our time, but they're also sort of good examples of what's good about capitalism. They create value. They make everybody else better off within the system and also the customers. So they create lots of value for everybody. Maybe the one thing where I'm not so sure about the UFC is the relentless drive to lower the total cost of ownership. I'm not sure about that there because the ticket prices are high, pay-per-views are high. Nevertheless, you have a lot of access to training and knowledge about martial arts. That's for free. The cost for me as a practitioner of martial arts has reduced dramatically in learning about martial arts through the UFC. So in that sense, they're lowering the total cost of ownership. But there's one thing that they don't have that Tesla has. The UFC is in a perishable goods business. Every fight is a perishable good. You know, if Usman fights Leon Edwards, then that fight will happen on Saturday evening London time, and then afterwards it's over. Like, you cannot reproduce that fight and keep making money of it. So you kind of have to charge higher ticket prices. Tesla can keep producing cars, change their models, bring in more value, sell the car maybe a little bit cheaper and add software. The UFC has that too. They can, you know, obviously they have promotion, they have monetization through social media and all that, but it's not the same. So there's certainly some slight differences, but let me get back to the conclusion here. Again, the two businesses, the UFC and Tesla, are the two quintessential businesses of our time. We can learn a lot from the positives. We can also learn from some of the negatives. And this is what it is. I mean, this is not a conjecture. This is what it is. Those are the two. You know, if you look at the value created from scratch in the last 10 to 15 years, those two businesses have created the most value, the most important businesses within their markets. And I would say not just within their markets, but also actually socially. I mean, you have, you know, politicians, comedians, actors, anybody who is not even involved in combat sports talking about, you know, the UFC, being knowledgeable about it the same way they talk about cars and electric cars. They, you know, lots of people like me, I wasn't a car person, and now I'm very, very interested in evolving technology for transportation. So that's it's really beautiful. Once you look at different places, you might find very interesting clues for where you are and who you are. And this is a very good example, the comparison between UFC and Tesla. Thank you.